Welcome to video number 4. Two different topics in this one. The first part is avoiding plagiarism, and the second part is giving you some tips on how to use your secondary sources to find some primary sources. So what are we going to talk about? The first thing we're going to talk about is what is plagiarism. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can avoid it. We're going to show you how you can use the information without copying the words directly from the sources. We'll talk a little bit about how to use quotations if you must, and we'll also talk about paraphrasing and summarizing. We'll also talk a little bit, but not in great detail, about citing your sources correctly. And then the last part we'll talk about will be using your secondary sources, of which many of you have lots, to find good primary sources for your topic if you're still struggling to do so. So let's start with plagiarism. What is plagiarism? Well, many people think it's copying someone else's work or borrowing someone's original ideas, but it's really very serious. It is, in fact, stealing the ideas of another person and presenting them as your own. The United States government and the law says that this is a real issue. This is protected by copyright law, and if you are plagiarizing, you are breaking the law. So you want to make sure that you don't turn in someone else's work as yours, you don't copy words and ideas directly from someone else's work without giving credit. Failing to put something that is a quotation from one of your sources in quotation marks, that is plagiarism. Giving incorrect information about the source of a quotation, so not correctly citing a source, could be considered plagiarism. Changing the words but copying the exact sentence structure is kind of a problem, which is a thing we'll show you how to avoid. And then copying so many words or ideas that essentially it is the other person's work. Let's talk about images, videos, and music. You will probably also want to use some images in your project. That is great. You also have to cite your image sources. I know a lot of you go on the internet, you find pictures, you use them, and sometimes consider them to be in the public sphere because they're on the internet. But you need to make sure that you are giving credit where credit is due. If it is on the internet, if you find it through Google Images, it does come from a place and you want to cite that source. And to the best of your ability, you want to find the original source of that image in order to cite it. So the two safe approaches to avoid plagiarism is to not use things if you think you might plagiarize, or make sure you confirm the work's usage permissions, like this is a picture that can be used, and make sure to cite them properly. All right, Mr. Jones will talk more about citations when he gets to that video, so don't worry too much about that just yet, but just know that you need to know where things come from so that you do not plagiarize. All right, back to our topic. So that's what is plagiarism. How can you avoid it? I will show you. So we'll go to my source list here, and I'm going to go to this one that's about the Manhattan Project. And I'm going to read a little bit about the Manhattan Project down here. These couple of paragraphs, I'm going to read them and then I'm going to paraphrase them. So, America declares war. So it says, the agencies leading up to the Manhattan Project were first formed in 1939 by President Roosevelt after U.S. intelligence operatives reported that scientists working for Adolf Hitler were already working on a nuclear weapon. Okay, so going to my cards. I'm going to just write it right here. The topic is the Manhattan Project. And here's my information. Let's double check my date. 1939, President Roosevelt created the project because Americans were afraid that Hitler and Germany had already developed a nuclear weapon. I can't spell Hitler apparently. All right, let's see how close what I have is to what they had. Close, but different enough. So I definitely use the date and I use President Roosevelt. Those are important. created the project. They said the agencies leading up to the Manhattan Project were first formed in 1939. President Roosevelt created the groups that would become. So we want to make sure that it means what it says in the source. It has to match the meaning, but it has to be different words because Americans were afraid that Hitler and Germany had already developed a nuclear weapon. They talk about the intelligence operatives reported that Adolf Hitler was working on a nuclear weapon. Okay, so that's my paraphrase for this. Let's do this next one. At first, Roosevelt set up the Advisory Committee on Uranium, a team of scientists and military officials tasked with researching uranium's potential role as a weapon. Based on the committee's findings, the U.S. government started funding research by Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, that's how I would say that, at Columbia University, which was focused on radioactive isotope separation, also known as uranium enrichment, and nuclear chain reactions. Okay, so I'm going to probably summarize this. I don't think I'm going to paraphrase all of it because it's full of a lot of detail that, while important, probably won't help me prove my thesis. So I'm going to say on my card, I'm going to say the first step was the creation of the, what do we call it, Advisory Committee on Uranium. Committee on Uranium, which funded research on the potential use of uranium in weapons. Let's see if I got that right. So they tasked with researching uranium's potential role as a weapon based on the committee's findings, funding research, focus on radioactive isotope and nuclear chain reactions. Let's see. Funded research on the potential use of uranium in weapons. Tasked with researching potential role as a weapon. Okay, so I have potential, and I have uranium, and I have research, but I do not think that I have plagiarized because it is enough mine in there. All right, let's go back here. Always want to mark the source. This is source C on my card. And this will be card, let's see, 20, 21, 22, 23. This is 23, if I'm keeping going with my card numbers. Okay, so source C, card 23. All right, so I've paraphrased. I did not plagiarize. I could also use a quote. So let's say I want to fully quote this. If I do, then what I'm going to do is go to the card and I'm going to put quotation marks and then I'm going to write what it says. Now I can copy and paste and you have to write it, but I want to make sure that I put it in quotations, and then I want to make sure that I say History Channel, and the article is called Manhattan Project. You need to be very careful when you are doing quotations that you are very clear as to where it came from. Otherwise, you are dealing with something that could be considered plagiarism. So this is also source C, and this is card 24. Okay, so we talked about plagiarism. We talked about not copying words directly from sources unless, of course, you're using the quotations. We talked a little bit about paraphrasing, and we did a little summarizing. Hopefully, watching me do that with my topic will help you figure out how to do it with yours. If not, ask your social studies or language arts teacher to give you a little bit of assistance in how to paraphrase or summarize. Make sure you're citing your sources correctly. We talked a little bit about that already. And so finally, we're going to get to using secondary sources to find primary sources. So as you are reading your secondary sources, you should be on the lookout for things that you could search for that might lead you to primary sources. So I'll go back to the first paragraph. The agencies leading up to the Manhattan Project were first formed in 1939 by President Roosevelt after U.S. intelligence operatives reported that scientists working for Hitler were already working on a nuclear weapon. Okay, so I read that, and that leads me to believe that there are documents somewhere, intelligence reports, where people filed the report with the government saying that scientists working for Hitler were working on a nuclear weapon. So I'm going to try to find that. So I'm going to go to a new window, and I'm going to say intelligence reports that Hitler was working on a nuclear weapon. Intelligence reports, okay. So, the Third Reich's nuclear program, scientific binders, no, Hitler and the bomb, wartime nuclear weapons. So this is an analysis of sources, so that's not it. This is a secondary source. Okay. It looks like all of these sources are just basically talking about the intelligence reports because they know that they exist. But it doesn't look like any of these sources are going to offer me a copy of the reports. So I'm going to stop looking for that because I'm not going to find it. The next thing that I might look for is the Advisory Committee on Uranium. So whenever a government creates an advisory committee or anything, there's a lot of paperwork that has to do with that. So I'm going to look to see if I can find any letters or anything that relates to the Advisory Committee on Uranium. Okay, so this is the Manhattan Project. So this is the U.S. Department of Energy, which is a government agency, and this is a .gov website. And it looks like these are links to actual primary sources. So this information here is all secondary, but I think I can get a letter from Albert Einstein. Let's see, it says, so they met to get, Franklin Roosevelt met with Einstein and talked about the recent research on fission chain reactions utilizing uranium. Okay, so here's this letter from Albert Einstein to the president at the time about this topic. This is an amazing primary source, and all I did was search for a term that I found in one of my secondary sources. If I go back, there's this thing that talks about early uranium research. I'm not really seeing a lot there, so that's not the best. Maybe here's a report. Talks about what the MOD report was. So it's a study on the feasibility of atomic bomb. So this is the first page of the report. This would be a great primary source too. So just going into my secondary source and searching for the Advisory Committee on Uranium led me to the Department of Energy's website, and I got two pretty decent primary sources. Einstein's letter, which I'm going to put in my source collection document, and also I have access now to this report on the feasibility of nuclear weapons or the atomic bomb. So I'll copy this and I'll put this in here too. All right, so there you have it. Talked a little bit about plagiarism, talked a little bit about how you can avoid it, discussed how you could do quotations, paraphrasing, and summarizing, led you to think about citing your sources correctly, and then also showed you an example of how you could use your secondary sources to find some primary sources. Good luck, and let us know if you have any questions.